The air in the dining room was thick with unspoken judgment, a familiar humidity I'd learned to breathe, a damp cloak that settled over me with every family gathering. His mother's voice, a silken whip, cracked through the strained silence that always seemed to precede her pronouncements. She was mid-sentence, a carefully curated tale of my perceived inadequacies woven with threads of passive aggression so fine they were almost invisible to the untrained eye, when his hand, a blur of sudden heat, connected with my cheek. The sharp sting was more of a shock than actual pain, a physical punctuation marked to the emotional barrage I'd endured for years. My head snapped back, the ringing in my ears a discordant counterpoint to the sharp gasp that escaped me, a small sound lost in the vastness of their opulent dining room. It wasn't the physical pain that registered most, but the sheer brazen entitlement behind the act. He'd always been protected, shielded by her unwavering adoration and his own burgeoning arrogance, a fact that had become as predictable as the setting sun. In that moment, however, something fundamental shifted. The familiar sting of injustice, usually a dull ache that settled deep in my bones, flared into a sharp, cold resolve. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, quiet clarity, a sudden illumination in the perpetual twilight of their disapproval. I knew with absolute certainty what I had to do. It had been building for years, this quiet erosion of my self-worth, a slow drip of disdain that had worn away at my confidence. Every family gathering, every casual dinner, felt like a performance review where I consistently failed to meet their impossibly high, unarticulated standards. His mother, Eleanor, was a master manipulator, her words laced with subtle digs that chipped away at my confidence with the precision of a sculptor, though her intention was destruction, not creation. She saw me as a convenient outlet for her own insecurities, a lesser being to prop up her precious son, David, and thus elevate her own perceived status. He, in turn, absorbed her every judgment, internalizing her disdain and reflecting it back at me with increasing vehemence, a mirror held up to her harshest criticisms. I was the perpetual disappointment, the one who didn't quite fit the perfect family mold they so desperately cultivated, a rogue element in their meticulously arranged tableau. Their home was a monument to their perceived success, a shrine to their elevated status. Impeccable, sterile, filled with expensive art that seemed to judge my every move, and even more expensive silences that amplified their judgment. My own life, by contrast, felt messy, vibrant, real, a kaleidoscope of experiences and emotions that stood in stark opposition to their monochrome existence. I worked in a field that Eleanor deemed too common, too hands-on, too devoid of the prestige she so desperately craved and attributed to herself and her family. My choices, my friends, my apartment, all were subject to her thinly veiled critiques, her pronouncements delivered with an air of inevitable truth. And he, David, my partner of 5 years, was her willing accomplice, her echo chamber. He never defended me, never challenged her narrative, never stepped between us. Instead, he'd often mirror her sentiments, his gaze distant, his words carefully chosen to avoid confrontation, which always meant siding with her, always prioritizing her comfort over my well-being. He'd perfected the art of appeasement, a skill he honed by sacrificing my feelings on the altar of his mother's approval, a constant, unspoken transaction. I had tried for so long to be the understanding girlfriend, the patient partner, the one who saw beyond the surface. I'd swallowed insults, rationalized his passive aggression, and convinced myself that love meant overlooking these constant slights, that enduring them was a testament to my devotion. I'd told myself that Eleanor's behavior was a product of her generation, her possessiveness a sign of her deep, albeit misguided, love for David. But the physical blow, the unexpected violence of it, changed everything. It was a boundary crossed, a line irrevocably erased, a brutal demarcation between what I had tolerated and what I could no longer endure. The shock of it, the raw physical violation, stripped away all the polite pretenses I had clung to, all the carefully constructed justifications I had used to protect myself. After he struck me, his hand still hovering in the space between us, a flicker of something almost like regret crossed his face, a fleeting shadow that was quickly replaced by a defensive stiffness, a hardening of his features. Eleanor, for her part, simply adjusted her pearls, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality, as if the incident had barely registered on her finely tuned radar of social propriety. It was as if the air had been cleared, not by the violence but by its immediate aftermath, the expected drama failing to materialize. This was the moment I realized with a sudden, almost detached clarity. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, a palpable entity in the room. My heart was still pounding, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, but a strange calm had settled over me, a stillness that felt more potent than any storm. I looked at David, at the faint redness blooming on my cheek, at Eleanor's imperious stare that seemed to bore holes through me, and I knew. There would be no shouting, no tears, no dramatic accusations, no pleas for understanding. My power lay not in confrontation, not in escalating the conflict, but in revelation, in the quiet unveiling of truth. "I need to get something," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning within me. I didn't meet David's eyes, instead focusing on a point just past his shoulder, a deliberate act of detachment. I stood up, my legs feeling a little shaky, a residual effect of the shock, and walked out of the dining room, leaving them in the charged atmosphere I had just created, a vacuum of expectation. I went into the study, a room filled with more of their curated possessions, more tangible proof of their elevated status, and opened the large, imposing oak desk. I didn't need to rummage, didn't need to search. I knew exactly where it was, a small, meticulously kept repository of my professional life. I pulled out a slim, unassuming file folder, its contents meticulously organized and dated, a testament to my own diligence. It contained years of correspondence, carefully preserved emails, text messages, and even a few scanned physical letters. These were the records of my professional achievements, the awards, the commendations, the overwhelmingly positive feedback from clients and colleagues that David and Eleanor so conveniently overlooked, so willfully ignored. I returned to the dining room, the folder held loosely in my hand, a fragile shield. David and Eleanor were still seated, the tension palpable, a silent standoff. Eleanor was about to launch into another carefully crafted narrative. I could see it in the subtle tightening of her jaw, about how I was too sensitive, how David had simply been trying to make a point, how I was overreacting to a minor incident. I cleared my throat gently, a soft sound that cut through the expectant quiet. "Before we continue," I began, my voice low but clear, carrying an authority I hadn't realized I possessed. "There's something I think you both should see." I walked over to the dining table, deliberately placing the folder on the polished wood, not quite in the center, but close enough to draw their immediate attention, a silent challenge. David's brow furrowed, a familiar look of impatience mixed with apprehension. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her suspicion a palpable wave. "What is this?" David asked, his tone laced with the familiar edge of impatience, the unspoken question being, "What drama are you creating now?" "This," I said, looking directly at Eleanor, then at David, my gaze unwavering, "is proof. Proof that the narrative you've both been living under, the one where I'm somehow incompetent, incapable, or simply not good enough, is entirely fabricated. This contains the documentation of my work, my successes, the recognition I've received. The kind of recognition that perhaps you, Eleanor, have always valued so highly, though never for me." I opened the folder, pulling out a particularly glowing client testimonial, a framed certificate from a prestigious industry award, and a printed email from a former professor praising my thesis, the cornerstone of my academic career. I laid them out on the table, not aggressively, but with a quiet finality, the weight of evidence settling between us. "David," I continued, my voice softening slightly, a deliberate contrast to the starkness of the documents, "you were always told I was lacking. You were fed this idea that I wasn't measuring up, that I was a less than ideal choice. But the truth is I've been excelling. I've been building a career, a life that is entirely my own, and it's been incredibly successful by objective standards. It seems those standards were never applied to me in this household, only to the image you wanted to maintain." Eleanor's face was a study in controlled fury, a storm brewing behind a placid facade. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between the documents and me, her composure beginning to fray. David, however, looked different. The arrogance had receded, replaced by a dawning confusion, a slow unraveling of his assumptions, then a hint of something that looked remarkably like shame. He picked up one of the documents, his fingers tracing the embossed seal of the award, a physical interaction with the tangible proof. This is from the Global Innovators Conference?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, the disbelief of-eyed. "And you won that?" "Yes, David," I replied, my gaze unwavering, meeting his hesitant stare. "I won that, and I received a substantial bonus for it. A bonus that allowed me to finally put a down payment on my own apartment, an apartment you both so often implied was a sign of my irresponsibility, my inability to manage my finances. I let them absorb this, the silence that followed, not the heavy, judgmental silence of before, but a hollow, echoing void, a testament to their shattered illusions. Eleanor's carefully constructed world was starting to crack, fissures appearing in the polished veneer of her superiority. The image she had so meticulously crafted of me as a hapless, undeserving partner for her son was crumbling under the weight of verifiable fact. David, the obedient son, the passive participant in their charade, was forced to confront the fact that he had been actively complicit in his mother's manipulations, and that his own judgment, his perception of me, had been severely skewed, poisoned by her constant input. The aftermath wasn't dramatic fireworks, no cathartic outburst of anger or recrimination. It was a slow, agonizing deflation, a quiet unraveling of the established order. Eleanor, faced with irrefutable evidence of my capabilities, retreated into a frosty silence, her usual pronouncements about my inadequacy suddenly sounding hollow, even ridiculous, in the face of my documented achievements. She couldn't argue with facts, with tangible success, with proof of a life lived well and achieved independently. She could only withdraw, her disapproval now a silent, impotent force, a ghost of her former self. David, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, the initial shame giving way to a deeper unease. The blow he had struck me now seemed to echo in the room, a brutal testament to his own ignorance and his mother's poisonous influence, a physical manifestation of the emotional damage he had inflicted. He avoided my eyes, his usual confident posture replaced by a slumped awkwardness, a man uncomfortable in his own skin. He didn't apologize, not directly, not with words, but the silence from him was a different kind of admission, a tacit acknowledgement of his wrongdoing. It was the quiet understanding that he had been wrong, terribly wrong, and that his complicity had had real, tangible consequences. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between us shifted, a subtle but significant recalibration of our relationship. Visits became less frequent, the conversation stilted, punctuated by long silences that were no longer filled with Eleanor's judgment but with a shared, unspoken discomfort. Eleanor's barbed comments ceased entirely, replaced by a strained politeness that felt far colder and more cutting than her previous criticisms. It was the politeness of someone who had lost the battle but not the war. David, for the first time, began to question his mother's narratives, albeit hesitantly, his loyalty to her subtly eroding. He started asking me about my work, not with condescension, but with a flicker of genuine curiosity, a desire to understand the person he had so consistently underestimated. The sting on my cheek faded, a physical scar slowly disappearing, but the clarity it brought, the profound realization it ignited, remained. I had shown them the truth, not with anger or a desire for retribution, but with a quiet unveiling of reality, a presentation of irrefutable facts. Their judgment, their disbelief was no longer my burden to carry. I had simply presented the facts, and in doing so, had dismantled the illusion they had built, the carefully constructed facade of my inadequacy. The emotional justice wasn't in their suffering, not in their humiliation, but in their silent, unavoidable realization of their own profound misjudgment, and the quiet reclamation of my own self-worth.